Welcome, everybody, to the 14th episode of Generation Jihad. I'm Tom Joscelyn, and I'm joined again this week with my colleague, Bill Roggio. Bill, say hi to everybody.
Hi, everybody.
We are senior fellows at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and we've been publishing FDD's Long War Journal for about 13 years now. I can't believe it's been that long, Bill. It's kind of ridiculous.
It's incredible. It really has been a long war. I think we did a good job when we named the website.
Well, it's been a long war to date. Of course, we're going to figure out where the U.S. goes from here. That's a big concern about what the U.S. is going to do going forward. But as we've said in the previous podcast, the jihadis aren't going to stop fighting. It's an endless jihad. And, during the time that we've been running FDD's Long War Journal, we've covered a number of jihadi groups, including both Sunni and Shiite terrorist organizations. And one of those is Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. This is one of those organizations which I always wish I could do more, had more time to cover, because I think it's pretty interesting. And just this past week, the French government made a major announcement with respect to AQIM. Florence Parly, France's Minister for the Armed Forces, tweeted that AQIM's longtime Emir, Abdulmalek Droukdel, he's a guy who's also known as Abu Musab Abdel Wadoud, had been killed in a counterterrorism operation in northern Mali on June 3rd. Now, that's a big deal. This isn't going to end AQIM or the threat from Al-Qaeda throughout the region, but Droukdel's a guy who goes way back. There's no doubt that his death is significant for Al-Qaeda, both AQIM and Al-Qaeda globally. The thing is, when we cover these guys, when we talk about these Al-Qaeda leaders, obviously there's sort of an endless train of them, right, Bill? I mean, we've been doing this for so long, and there's obviously guys are taken out time and time again, whether it be ISIS or Al-Qaeda. But Droukdel is interesting because he's survived for so long. When you get into his biography, which I'm going to get into a little bit here, this is one of those guys we talk about, and something you and I have talked about in previous podcasts, Bill, how some of these guys survive for 2 decades before they finally get taken out of action.
Yeah, this guy has been involved in waging jihad since the 1990s. With the back in Algeria before Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, right? It's a common theme: the resiliency of these groups, the deep bench, and the amount of time these guys get to lead before we get to whack them. He has been in the game since the founding of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb since 2006. Name me a U.S. military commander that is focused on a single theater and has led troops there for 14 years straight. So, yeah, he's an important player. He's a very influential, as we're going to discuss, a very influential Al-Qaeda leader, not just for AQIM, but for Al-Qaeda global. And, his death hurts them, but Al-Qaeda certainly got their mileage out of him, and his deputies have been waiting to step up, and now they're going to get their chance.
Yeah, and of course, as we're recording this, AQIM has not confirmed Droukdel's death, and that's always a caveat that we try and express to everybody to make sure everybody's clear on. And Droukdel is interesting because he goes back even before the founding of AQIM, of course. When you look into his biography, at first he was a bomb maker for the Armed Islamic Group, which is commonly known by an acronym of its French name, or the GIA. In that role, the UN accused Droukdel of building, and this is a quote from the UN here, explosive devices that killed hundreds of civilians in attacks perpetrated in public areas. That's significant because later on, Al-Qaeda and AQIM became very sensitive to civilian casualties. It's one of the ways that they sort of started to deviate a little bit or differentiate themselves from ISIS, and even before the rise of ISIS, they became concerned about that. The GIA prefigured the rise of ISIS in some ways. It committed the same types of shockingly barbaric acts in the 1990s that ISIS would become notorious for some years later. Now, Al-Qaeda and like-minded jihadis, they sought to revamp the jihad in the wake of the GIA's failures in Algeria and elsewhere. After the group alienated much of the population, Algerians were really going for the butchery and barbarism of the GIA. Now, this led to the formation of a group known as the Salafist Group for Preaching in Combat, or GSPC. That's another acronym of a French name. And this was formed in the late 1990s. Droukdel assumed leadership of the GSPC in 2004. Just 2 years later, in September 2006, Droukdel announced his fealty to Osama bin Laden. And his oath of allegiance, or bay'ah, which is something we talk about frequently, was accepted by Ayman al-Zawahiri. That led in late 2006 and early 2007 to the GSPC being rebranded as Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. Now, some analysts and commentators claim that AQIM was never really Al-Qaeda, right, Bill? We heard this. We heard this a lot from 2007 onward, especially for the next several years after AQIM was formally launched. It's not really Al-Qaeda. And we disagreed with that for a lot of reasons.
Yeah, this is just part of the disconnect the dots paradigm that exists in our field. It's very frustrating. What happens when the leader of a group swears allegiance to Osama bin Laden, and its fighters, swear allegiance to that individual? It makes them Al Qaeda. It's pretty simple, but people want to ignore it or reject it.
Yeah, and beyond the bay'ah, I mean, of course, we knew that there was plenty of evidence or connective tissue between AQIM and Al Qaeda senior leadership. We're going to talk about some of that connective tissue today because that's often overlooked. This becomes an especially important argument to revisit, what Bill and I, or what I've called the disconnected dots analysis that say AQIM isn't really part of Al Qaeda. There's a lot of reasons that's wrong and has been wrong all along. But, when France announced Droukdel's death, they said something very interesting. They said that not only was the Emir of AQIM, but that he was a member of Al Qaeda's management committee, and that he was Ayman al-Zawahiri's third deputy. Isn't that interesting? Now, I reached out to U.S. Africa Command for a sort of follow-up to see if they could confirm this. They confirmed Droukdel's death previously, didn't confirm these details. They emphasized AQIM and Shabab are part of al-Qaeda's network, but didn't really confirm these specific details. I think that's a mistake. I think U.S. military leadership should be educating people on what's going on here. That's sort of a general frustration you and I have, Bill, right, is that there's no real push within U.S. military circles to explain what's going on, and it seems like the clock is running out on a lot of this.
Yeah, I mean, look, the French don't have a reason to lie about this, that's for sure. If the U.S. military knows this, if U.S. AFRICOM or Africa Command is aware of this information and can confirm it, there's no reason that we shouldn't be given a confirmation on that. Instead, it just seems like, the military is just sort of running the clock out on this thing.
So, this isn't really surprising to us that the head of AQIM, which is one of al-Qaeda's regional branches, as they call it, would also be a member of al-Qaeda's senior leadership team. And the reason why it isn't surprising is because we've documented this phenomenon in the past, and we documented it specifically when it came to AQAP. You remember, Bill, going through the evidence and the files and public statements and other sort of sources of intelligence and evidence on this guy. The Nasser al-Wahishi served as al-Qaeda's general manager, and then he was later identified as the deputy emir, in fact, of al-Qaeda globally. He was the former aide-de-camp to Osama bin Laden, a co-founder of AQAP, that's Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And he's somebody who was clearly part of Al-Qaeda's management team, and we identified other guys around him who were likely part of Al-Qaeda's senior management team. And we've talked in a previous episode of the podcast, we talked about Qasem al-Raymi, who was killed in January of this year. Al-Raymi was probably a part of Al-Qaeda's senior management team, and his replacement, Khalid Batarfi in Yemen, is probably a member of Al-Qaeda's senior management team. So we don't really find this surprising at all, but we do find it odd that we just can't get the U.S. government to actually confirm what's going on, right?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, look, I think it should be pretty clear at this point in time. If you're the head of one of Al-Qaeda's branches, it's very likely they're on Al-Qaeda's management team, and probably some senior deputies from each branch as well. It makes sense. Al-Qaeda is looking to coordinate its activities globally and regionally. And so, yeah, there's no when you passed along that bit of information that Droukdel was on Al-Qaeda's management committee and third deputy Zawahiri, I mean, that's just a shoulder shrug moment for me. It's kind of what I expected.
Yeah, and I agree. I mean, listen, we've talked to sources who say that Al-Qaeda formed a cross-regional Shura Council that includes members of the so-called affiliates. Now, the affiliates really in Al-Qaeda's scheme are regional branches which are waging jihad in their designated areas to lay the groundwork for resurrecting emirates, which would then link up to become a caliphate. Now, this has been dismissed as a fantasy by Western policymakers on a number of occasions previously. Of course, with the rise of ISIS, everybody had to take the drive to build a caliphate more seriously. But this has been Al-Qaeda's goal all along. We're going to talk a little bit about that more today. But this idea that we're talking about the cross-regional Shura Council that incorporates members of Al-Qaeda's so-called affiliates, which we really refer to as Al-Qaeda as regional branches, this is yet another reason why this hardline distinction between Al-Qaeda's quote-unquote core and affiliates led to this false dichotomy in counterterrorism circles that we've sought to debunk on a number of occasions, because it just doesn't hold water. I mean, everybody now admits and concedes that AQAP, which is far afield from Afghanistan and Pakistan, that they are, in fact, do have members and senior leaders who are part of Al-Qaeda's senior management team. We now have the French saying that Abdulmalek Droukdel was a part of Al-Qaeda's senior management team. I mean, what's the big deal here? We should be able to get to a common sense sort of empirical, evidence-based analysis and definition of Al-Qaeda. But that leads me to basically what we're going to talk about today a little bit, Bill, on all this stuff. You and I, we're going to do a future podcast on this. You can add, if you're one of our dedicated listeners, you can add this to the list of things Tom said we're going to do an episode on. I now have a running list, which you can hang me with later on. But one of the things that Bill and I advocated in Washington and sort of fought uphill on was the public release of all of Osama bin Laden's files. These are all the files found during the May 2011 raid in Abbottabad, Pakistan, that that led to bin Laden's death. He was killed by U.S. Navy SEALs, and those Navy SEALs scooped up just an extremely large amount of media. And why do we advocate for the release? Well, there's some conspiracy theories out there. We'll debunk those in the future episode as well. There's some real nonsense. I mean, you can bleep out what I would actually want to say about it, but we'll just say it's to be polite. But the real reason why we advocated for the release of those files is because, as incredible as it may sound, the U.S. and its allies never came up with a uniform definition of al-Qaeda. Not even the nearly 2 decades since 9/11. I mean, there's still widespread disagreement over how al-Qaeda is structured, how it works. And we've argued that Osama bin Laden's files and other recovered document caches, and there are other ones, are crucial for understanding how the organization works, because these are primary source documents that are not meant for public consumption. This is how they're talking to each other behind the scenes, and it gives you insights into how they're structured and how they work. And lo and behold, one of the things we find out by going through bin Laden's files, and I was looking through this, we're recording this on a Friday afternoon, and I was looking through this the last couple nights in preparation for this podcast. You find AQIM all over the files, right, Bill? I mean, this is you find all sorts of files involving Al-Qaeda and Islamic Maghreb and how it works within Al-Qaeda's scheme, going back to immediately, we're going to focus today on the period right after the GSPC becomes AQIM in 2006 and 2007. There's a series of files from there on that you can see that this wasn't just rhetoric. This wasn't just sort of something they said in name only. They just claimed to be Al-Qaeda in name only. But there's all sorts of connective tissue there between these two that's worth documenting. And this is something Bill and I are going to talk a little bit about today. I mean, does that make sense to you as a way to structure this, Bill? That's basically, why we're going to talk about these files. And it's tough. We're going to go through these files with you guys on the podcast. We're going to publish them at Long War Journal as well. And once I get my act together and get my get my published analysis done, but we're gonna go through this a little bit today and talk about it, because I think it's worth talking about in a way that listeners can understand, to make these characters pop, make them understand why it matters, right?
Yep, that's absolutely correct. I mean, these documents, the bin Laden files and other documents recovered, are key to understanding the group and key to understanding how AQIM fits into Al-Qaeda's global scheme. Again, I'm just going to say it again. When bin Laden's files were recovered, there was very little interest in getting them released and going through them. And actually, most of the effort was to bury the bin Laden files. We led the charge, as you said, to get these released. Really, Tom did a fantastic job just fighting to get this done. And they're released, and people still don't care. It's like
it didn't really change anything. No, I mean, basically, it satiated our quest to get the files, but it didn't change the analysis or analytical framework one iota. And we didn't do this just for us. We hope other people would pick up on the files and go through them. And there's been very minimal, I would say, effort.
There's too many files for us to all go through. We'd need a team of 100 people in order to go through each and every file.
I even saw something on Twitter of somebody claiming that one of his colleagues had gone through them all. I'm like, no, you gotta be kidding me. You don't have any idea what you're looking at if you're claiming that. There's so much material there. But still, look, we have enough files to say something about this intelligence, not just one or two, but dozens. And we're going to talk about a handful. We're going to talk about a handful from that set, because I can't go through every single one of them on this podcast. We can drone you to death on this stuff just by you listening to all the different nom de guerres and all the ins and outs. But let's give you a brief summary. Let's give listeners a brief summary of some of the stuff that caught our eye going through the files. All right, Bill?
Yep.
All right, so let's start off with, so now this is right after the GSPC becomes AQIM in 2006 and 2007, as I said. There's a file that was sent to Osama bin Laden, which is, it's actually, we're going to talk about the addendum to a larger file, and in the ODNI, this is the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, in their infinite wisdom, they didn't actually put out complete chains of correspondence when they released some of these files to the public between 2015 and 2017. So, basically, we're trying to put together these chains of correspondence. And what we're going to talk about is really the addendum to another file that wasn't identified in one of these releases. And this addendum is written by Yunus al-Mauritani. This is one of your favorites back in the days, Bill. We covered his capture in Pakistan, which we'll get to in a second. But Yunus al-Mauritani is an interesting figure, because he's somebody who, according to the Treasury Department, the U.S. government, which designated him in 2011 based in part on what was found in Osama bin Laden's files. He's somebody who went from negotiating the formal merger of GSPC into Al-Qaeda's ranks, making it AQIM, and then he went on to become a leading member of AQ senior leadership's external operations arm. And, we know from the files that are captured, and including a number that we're not going to talk about today, and some of them we are, that Osama bin Laden endorsed and funded, his plan. This is Yunus al-Maritani's plan to conduct Mumbai-style attacks in Europe in 2010, 2011. And that multiple of the files recovered in bin Laden's compound were Mauritani's reports to bin Laden about this and other plans to attack the West. So this is a guy who, he went from, people, if you argued, well, Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb is not really Al-Qaeda. Here's a guy who actually negotiated the merger of the GSPC to become AQIM, and he becomes a senior AQ figure, not just within its sort of regional scheme or regional architecture, but actually with an eye and a responsibility and a role of trying to attack the West. So, Bill, we looked through this file, and it's a summary of the Unity Initiative. I was wondering if you were looking through it, what if you thought anything popped out to you. A couple things popped out to me. I'll give you a first crack at it.
Yeah, look, I mean, really, the first paragraph is what popped out at me, because they say the brothers in what used to be the Salafist group for call and combat. Well, they used to be because they became Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. I mean, when you look at that, you have it's full confirmation right then and there. I mean, yes, of course, we have the buyout and we know the cross-pollinization in leaders, but, I read that, then they say this unity and consolidation of the ranks under the term Al-Tawhid created the support that the Caliphate state was based on, right? I mean,
yep. Al-Tawhid, yeah. I mean, monotheism, the monotheism banner, right? Created for support that the Caliphate state was based on. Exactly right. I mean, right from the get-go, it's saying, hey, this is all about building the architecture for a new caliphate.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, and we're told that Al-Qaeda isn't interested in a caliphate. Well, why does Al-Qaeda have its regional branches? It has its regional branches in order to support its ultimate goal of reestablishing the caliphate. It all says it right there in the first paragraph of this. And I look at that, and to me, the rest here is details. They're talking about fighters. We got these many Moroccans, and now we have this, and we're putting them here, and we're putting them there. But when I'm reading these documents, like that to me is what pops out first and foremost.
Yeah, and when you go through the document, I mean, of course, it's trumpeting the Unity Initiative, which is the GSPC becoming AQIM and becoming formally part of Al-Qaeda. And so you can read it from the perspective that Yunus al-Maritani is trying to really pump up the whole idea of what's going on here, and maybe that's the case. But it's interesting that, of course, he credits Sheikh Abu Abdullah, who is bin Laden, for coming up with this initiative, which was meant to strike both the far enemy and the near enemy, which basically meant to strengthen the jihadis' ranks. And then he says it was carried out by Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri. So it basically was blessed and endorsed by bin Laden that this was going to happen. But then the actual carrying out of the act was carried out by Ayman al-Zawahiri. Now that's interesting, because we're going to get into that Zawahiri has been playing a big role in managing these regional branches and affiliates all along. Right, Bill? Yep,
that's exactly correct. I mean, we know that with Shabab, right? He actually wanted Al-Shabaab, which of course is Al-Qaeda's branch in East Africa, to publicly declare its allegiance. It was done privately, but Zawahiri was an advocate for making it public. Bin Laden, of course, and we think
it was Zawahiri anyway, because that happened. There was a file that was authored that seems to be authored by him.
Yes,
right. So, but the issue between them that people got wrong was it wasn't that Al Qaeda or Bin Laden was rejecting Shabab's oath of or buyout or oath of allegiance. That's not what he said. He just didn't want to make it public. Whereas Zawahiri, we presume that Zawahiri wanted to make it public.
Yeah, because he was
that wrong.
Bin Laden was afraid that aid groups would stop distributing aids in famine-stricken areas where Shabab controlled, and that's quite strategic thinking there from Bin Laden.
Yep. And now going through this file, I was struck too, because one of the things that Yunus al-Maritani says to Bin Laden in this file is that Abu Musab al-Zarqawi students arrived as well, who, and this is a quote now, and they wouldn't be satisfied with anything other than VBIEDs and the suicide attacks, so vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices and suicide attacks. And he says because this generation was raised at the hands of the internet through Al-Shabaab, which is Al-Qaeda senior leadership's main media hub, and Al-Furqan, which is of course the Islamic State of Iraq, and then the Islamic State as Central Leadership's main media hub, and other productions, showing that they were basically still considered part of the same sort of architecture at that time. Now, we know from an interview that Droukdel gave in the New York Times, I think it was in 2008, that Zarqawi actually did play a role in brokering the formal merger of GSPC and al-Qaeda's ranks. He said that actually in the press. And this is, again, this type of connective tissue where Zarqawi is playing a role in not only leading the jihad in Iraq at the time, this is obviously prior to his death in mid-2006, but he's also brokering these connections and these ties and these relationships and communications between North and West Africa, all the way back to al-Qaeda senior leadership.
Yeah, and look, I mean, of course, we were told Zarqawi, wasn't part of al-Qaeda in Iraq. If you'd listen to what the Islamic State claims, that, of course, is just yet another piece of evidence. And look, Zarqawi had, aside from being influential, a lot of individuals from leaders and fighters from North Africa came to fight in Iraq. And so that gave him a lot of pull as well with, he had a lot of connective tissue there between the AQIM and Al-Qaeda in Iraq because of that cross-pollinization of fighters as well.
Yeah, and Mauritani in this file, he goes through some of the different initiatives taken by the Algerian government to try and end the jihad, and he gives them credit in some respects, and then sort of says that basically Al-Qaeda's scheme here is going to undo the Algerian government's efforts and the efforts by others, presumably throughout the region. You can also see in the file, which is also interesting, is that Abu al-Abbas, now we know who that is. Abu al-Abbas is, of course, Mukhtar Belmokhtar, another al-Qaeda commander who had a strained relationship with Droukdel at times. But Mauritani's talking about Abu al-Abbas's key role in all this. And you can see from this file and other files that Belmokhtar himself is clearly part of al-Qaeda's scheme all along.
Yeah, that falling out, I can't remember what year that was. It was in the mid-2010s where he actually briefly left al-Qaeda and then formed his own group, Al-Mur Batoon.
Well, he left AQIM.
He left AQIM,
he didn't leave Al-Qaeda. He was still part of Al-Qaeda.
Right, reported directly to Zarqawi, and then they had Zawahiri, I'm sorry. And then they had some type of a rapprochement at some point, and he rejoined the ranks at AQIM. And by the way, we still don't know what the status of Mukhtar Belmokhtar is.
I think he's dead, but
I think so too,
look,
but we never.
I mean, if I were a betting man, of course I'd bet he was gone. But again, like you said, Bill, these guys are like zombies, until you get cut off their head and put a stake through their hearts, you're just never really sure.
Yeah, he was reported dead so long ago, and yet they never issued him. I think he certainly is important enough to be named, right, to get a martyrdom statement. But
but Al-Qaeda's been squirrely. Yeah, and Al-Qaeda's been squirrely about that.
They have.
I mean, there's a lot now. There are a lot of presumed bodies that haven't been recognized by Al-Qaeda senior leadership. Hamza bin Laden,
number one,
Asim Amar. There's a whole string of them you can point to where, and we'll get into a little bit about some of these guys in a minute here. But yeah, I mean, I agree. I mean, who knows? I mean, at the end of the day, unless you're basically there for forensic confirmation, or you have a picture of the body, or you have some sort of definitive confirmation, it's always tough. There's always ambiguity. But yeah, I mean, I think there's plenty of reporting and evidence that he most likely is dead at this point. So moving on. So this is a guy. Now, what I thought was interesting, revisiting Yunus al-Mauritani's sort of brief dossier and profile, is that he was captured in Pakistan in sometime around early September 2011. And we know that the bin Laden files were used to identify exactly how important he was in Al-Qaeda's scheme. And he was captured not in Afghanistan or somewhere else, but in Pakistan. Now, Bill, this goes to show this guy, Yunus al-Mauritani, he's in Pakistan after all these years, and he's planning against the West, and he's playing a lead role against the West. And, this shows that after all those years that Al-Qaeda still had enough juice in Pakistan to basically keep a network going, even the external operations part of its network going, of course, up till his capture.
Yeah, right. And look, the Pakistanis said at the time, you got to take anything the Pakistanis say with a grain of salt, but he said he was, this is a quote, tasked personally by Osama bin Laden to focus on hitting targets of economical importance in the United States of America, Europe, and Australia. There's one other interesting thing, and I realize I'm sort of digressing a little bit, but
hey, it's our podcast. You can digress all you want.
It's funny. They get
well,
bin
not
Laden.
all you want. We don't want to do it all. We don't want to digress too much. I mean, I can go off on a tangent too. We could talk about the 1986 New York Football Giants if you want, but nobody cares.
A pick and shovel team, giants among men.
No, or the 2018 Eagles championship. I'd love to discuss that.
And they're going to snap it, and it's Trey Burton who throws, caught. Foles, touchdown.
Okay, that's the end of the digression. But go ahead. Yeah.
So the the Pakistanis catch him after bin Laden is killed in the raid because the United States presents enough evidence on this guy that the Pakistanis are forced to act. If the Pakistanis had their way, guys like Yunus Maritani would still be walking around Pakistan. I have no doubt about that. I know there was a lot of pressure on Pakistan after the bin Laden raid to clean up some of these guys, and you had individuals killed in drone strikes but look, he was a very, very influential figure within Al Qaeda, and his links to AQIM. This was a big capture for the United States, and like you had mentioned, he's one of my favorites because he puts a lot of these pieces of the puzzle together. He's that piece of the puzzle that you need to get everything to connect, and that's always how I viewed him. And the Bin Laden files have borne this out.
Yeah, he was a big capture, and eventually, of course, instead of being brought to the U.S. and tried, he was repatriated to his native country of Mauritania. Now, why is that interesting, or why is that potentially problematic? Well, we have another file to go to. So that first document we're talking about from Yunus al-Mauritani, which again illustrates the connective tissue between what became known as AQIM and AQ senior leadership, that was authored sometime around 2006. Here's another file a little bit later, in which it's relayed to Osama bin Laden that Droukdel, the late, great Abdulmalek Droukdel, the former Emir of AQIM, had sent correspondence discussing a proposed truce with Mauritania. And Mauritania had been involved in these efforts too. I'm sorry, now it's going to get confusing for listeners.
Let's call him Yunus, Tom.
We'll call him Yunus. That's a good way of doing it. Yeah, thank you. Good for that. Yeah, because otherwise we'll get to it. Anyway, in any event, Droukdel proposed this truce with Mauritania in a letter to AQ senior leadership. And AQ senior leadership decides to basically go about determining whether or not this would be kosher. And they determined it was, in fact. And you can see in this file that essentially Al Qaeda was very much willing to negotiate with the apostate governments as long as it was going to basically further their objectives and their overall strategy. Now, this is a little bit problematic. I mean, this shows that this is not, that Al Qaeda is much more sophisticated when it comes to this stuff than people give them credit for. You can see in this file, Bill, that some of the names who were involved in evaluating this. I mean, you've got guys like, Sheikh Abu Yahya al-Libi. You've got Haji Uthman, who was one of the main senior figures around bin Laden, and subsequently he's killed. You got Sheikh Mahmoud, who's Atiya Abdul-Rahman.
Yep.
And they got others, I mean, this is a who's who of the Al-Qaeda senior leadership is looking into this and is deciding to bless this idea that they can have a truce with Mauritania. That's problematic. I mean, and it also sort of lays the groundwork for what Al-Qaeda is trying to do in West Africa right now, where Droukdel helped stand up this new outfit known as the Group for the Support of Muslims in Islam, which sounds, of course, all sorts of nice and friendly, and they're anything but. And they've been fighting in Mali and West Africa for a few years now. They've reached out and been willing to negotiate with the Malian government as long as the French get out of the area, right? Because this shows they're willing to negotiate with these so-called apostate governments as long as they can strike deals that benefit them. But this is very different, I think, than what the public perception of Al-Qaeda is. Don't you think, Bill, that this is a sort of a key insight here, that they're willing to play these political games and machinations in order to further their agenda? Yeah,
look, they have to get a religious ruling, and that's what they say. They were tasked to write a legal research on the truce. That's a quote. So this has to be religiously based. So their determination was, yes, religiously this is approved. And again, as you mentioned, as long as it's, it furthers their goals. One of the things that strikes me at this time, I recall reports that the Mauritanian government was terrified of what AQIM was doing at that time. They were attacking military bases. And they just didn't have the manpower to fight it. To fight it, so they would do a truce, and so we shouldn't be shocked that Al Qaeda agrees with the Taliban to conduct a withdrawal deal with the United States because it furthers the Taliban's goal. That's how you know the deal is good, because Al-Qaeda signs off on it. And, yeah, and
by the way, I mean, there could be, I'm sure, I mean, listen, the jihadis that we've talked about, they're not automatons.
No.
They're not robots. I mean, I'm sure there's dissent. I'm sure there are people within the ranks that don't get it, that don't want to have the Taliban negotiate with U.S. at all, right? But, I mean, formally and officially, Al-Qaeda's endorsed that deal, and I don't see any reason why to think that that's sort of out of bounds for them, given this piece of evidence and other pieces of evidence that they're willing to do this.
Yeah, and look, to me, this is why Al-Qaeda is will always be a far more dangerous group than the Islamic State. It's willing to use all levers of power. It's willing to use it. This is a form of Al-Qaeda diplomacy. It's for Al-Qaeda, right? They're willing to use that to further their goals, where the Islamic State just will fight its way to achieve its goals. It won't consider any other means in order to further itself. So that's why I've always viewed Al-Qaeda as far more dangerous. And the Islamic State may be willing to conduct more deadly attacks or, attacks on civilians, things of that nature. But strategically, Al-Qaeda, tops it out, and documents like this is what lead me to believe that.
Yeah, the way I would put it is, I think this is a very mature insurgent perspective.
Yes.
Right? That they basically know that they have to sort of keep at bay where they can cut deals, they will, to keep their to assist in basically achieving their long-term goals, which is about building an emirate in the region. And we're going to get to that in a second again in one of these other documents. But this document shows a very much mature perspective from an insurgency. They understand what they're doing. They understand how to use political levers in order to further their goals. They don't just have to go out and attack. That they can use violence and the threat of violence to achieve those political goals as well. And this document lays out, sort of the details, as the quid pro quo between AQIM and the Mauritanian government. They say, as long as we don't commit any military attacks in Mauritania, they're gonna, agree not to intercept any of the Mujahideen or cause evil in the country, and they're not going to intercept the seekers of knowledge, which basically means that AQ is going to get this ability to proselytize throughout Mauritania. Which is very dangerous.
Probably the most important part of that whole agreement.
Yeah, I mean, that's the part that, and people got that wrong, of course, during the so-called Arab uprisings. Remember, everybody was thinking, well, Al-Qaeda's not, attacking necessarily, in all these different places, so therefore these local outfits are they're not really Al-Qaeda, they're Ansar al-Sharia. Well, that was all rubbish. I mean, we knew that Al-Qaeda wanted to use the political vacuums that were created in the Arab uprisings to proselytize for their cause. And that's a very dangerous thing to do, because it basically is converting more people who ultimately can become terrorists or jihadists for them in these different theaters.
Yep, that's absolutely correct, Tom. And I've always viewed ignoring their ideology, ignoring their proselytizing, as to be our greatest weakness. Religion's icky to Americans, and therefore we're just going to pretend that that's not part of this equation, but it's the biggest part of this equation.
Yeah, I mean, you can see in this document that they had to have a religious ruling, as you said, for figuring out if this was all going to be kosher for them. They also, came to other terms. Basically there was a 1-year effective term for the agreement, and it was subject to renewal, and that the government of Mauritania was going to give them 10 to 20 million euros annually, pretty good chunk of change, so long as the contract was in effect. And basically it was going to keep going on like this, and this was basically the bottom line from them was they saw at this time was they could have this truce with Mauritania, and otherwise they could focus on Algeria and other issues.
To put it in mob terms, Tom, this was protection money. In the agreement, they said they'll get $10 to $20 million in exchange. It'll prevent the kidnapping of tourists. So Al-Qaeda, that's just how it's going to be for them. Though, you pay us and we won't attack you. We won't kidnap your tourists. We won't do this. We won't do that.
Yep, and then they use Mauritania as basically a rear base, as they said, a safe rear base. Yep. So this is again sophisticated strategic thinking on all this. Now, lo and behold, after this file came out, Abu Hafs al-Mauritani, a famous once upon a time Al-Qaeda ideologue in pre-9/11 Afghanistan, he confirmed that it actually went into effect, that this actually did happen, this truce between the two. Boy, is that fascinating. And this isn't one of those,
We know it because the violence ceased. in Mauritania. You stop receiving reports of jihadist attacks and kidnappings. They moved on. And, so, when you put all the pieces of the puzzle together, Abu Hafs gives us the final confirmation that this goes through. And it's amazing. It makes you wonder if that truce is still in existence today.
Well, and what other truces are they willing to cut? What other deals are they willing to cut? We documented this in some of the other bin Laden files, that bin Laden signed off with a truce with the Pakistani government. Yep. Because they were using violence through the Pakistani Taliban and others to ratchet up the pressure on Pakistani government officials. And there's sort of this back and forth you could see in the files about whether or not Al-Qaeda was going to agree to a truce so they could concentrate on their other enemies. And the endorsement came down from bin Laden and Atiya Abdul-Rahman that was in their interest to do that. And Pakistani officials some politicians said that, in fact, the truce had been enacted. So again, this is where the value in the files is, understanding how this all works, that you're seeing a sophisticated actor here who, despite all of its shortcomings and problems and flaws and setbacks, is thinking about the world in the way, beyond just hijacking planes and committing bombings. They're looking at things politically.
Yeah, their ultimate goal is the establishment of the caliphate, and they'll do what it takes. If it means cutting a deal with an infidel government, they'll do that. If it means fighting them and bombings in cities and attacking military, they'll do that too. And so, again, it's I know I'm repeating myself, but it's what makes them the more dangerous, the more sophisticated terrorist group.
Yeah, I would say more sophisticated insurgency group in some ways is what I would say.
Yes, it's a terrorist insurgency. Yes, right.
Yeah, I mean, because the terrorist component of this is
subset.
Yeah, right. And it's sort of a interesting conundrum there, and to turn away the threats from these different groups. But we'll put that aside for the second. So let's move on to the next one. So one of the other ones we highlight going through prepping for the show this week is this letter from Osama bin Laden, or we think it's from Osama bin Laden, presumably from bin Laden, to Droukdel himself. The author, again, presumably bin Laden, mentions that Droukdel's letters had arrived and showing they were in regular contact. This is one of the pieces of evidence they were in regular contact. And I thought what I pulled out of this file, and again, once I get my act together, I'm going to post all these in order at Long War Journal so people could follow along. It'd be great if you could do that right now, wouldn't it be, folks? But that requires me having my act together a lot more than I do right now. Got too many things going on in the middle of a pandemic and all sorts of craziness. But what I pulled out of this, Bill, was this language I sent you, this key quote about target selection, right? So here's another myth-busting moment for us. There's this false dichotomy that grew up in counterterrorism circles that Al-Qaeda was really only interested in attacking the far enemy, meaning the West and America and America's allies, and that it didn't really want to get embroiled in attacking the local enemies at all. Well, Bill, take a look at this quote and what stands out to you right away. I mean, it's right there, isn't it, in plain black and white, presumably from bin Laden. Yep. What does he say? I'll let you go and delve into it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the one, your brothers continue in bold operations against the global and local infidels, and we will be happy because of it. I mean, that's the one that, if it is possible to strike the targets far away from the innocents, then it would be desired to target that place. So they're telling you right here, fight locally, fight globally. It's nothing. Look, the reality is more Muslims have been killed by Al-Qaeda and, of course, the Islamic State as well, than far more than Westerners and Americans. So, you and I don't need to see this. This is merely confirmation of what we already know, but it's always nice to be able to read it.
Yeah, and I mean, this author, again, presumably bin Laden, he writes, choosing and identifying priorities and which ones we will begin with. Who's the greatest infidel apostate today, he says. But this doesn't mean that it's the greatest destroyer of all time and in every place. So in other words, he's saying your target selection is going to change, right? Who you're going to hit on any given time. And he said, it's possible to strike targets away from the innocents, then it would be desirable to target that place. In other words, he's saying, again, this is the Al-Qaeda concern with not killing innocents. Earlier, I mentioned that the UN had fingered Droukdel for bombings that killed hundreds of civilians. Here's the Al-Qaeda. Once you come in the Al-Qaeda fold, that's they're trying to avoid that as much as they can because they see that as something that in these Muslim majority countries is going to turn off the population they're trying to convert to their cause.
Yeah, and look, the GIA, the collapse of that whole jihad in Algeria, that's a very touchy issue. within jihadist circles and particularly Al-Qaeda, so they studied that. And I always found it ironic that Droukdel, who played a very significant role in the making of bombs to kill thousands of civilians, winds up being the guy who leads Al-Qaeda.
Hundreds anyway. Yeah, hundreds.
Hundreds,
anyway,
I'm sorry. Yeah, who winds up leading Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. But, obviously the guy grew. And, but here you have, which we believe is Osama bin Laden, continue to counsel him and keep him on the path, the Al-Qaeda path, so to speak.
Yeah. Now, after this, one other thing about this file before we move on. And again, wouldn't it be great if you guys could read along with us? So I'm going to have to make that a priority this weekend. Maybe before the show comes out, I'll try and get this up, or at least afterwards. Sometimes so you can follow along and listen to what we're saying. Because I've got other files too. But you could see in this the author, and this is one of the reasons why we think it's bin Laden wrote it, is because he's writing from a position of authority.
Yes.
Clearly, above everybody in Al-Qaeda's scheme. And he gives a nugget here. He says, look, this is a direct quote now. There are some obstacles in the correspondence of letters between the brothers and me. So any message is sent to me, please send a copy to Abu Muhammad, meaning Zawahiri, because that's Zawahiri's code name, his nom de guerre, his alias in these correspondence. Please send a copy to, Abu Muhammad, Sheikh Ayman al-Zawahiri. And then it says, he is in constant contact with the brothers and is in charge of following up with the affairs in the Islamic Maghreb. Well, isn't that interesting? Again, this goes back to the idea that, Zawahiri has been managing these affiliates, so-called regional branches, for many, many years.
Yeah, look, and what really sticks out with me with that, remember when at the time of bin Laden's death, you had an op-ed in I believe it was the Washington Post, saying that bin Laden was a lion in winter and basically stuck in his little house and disconnected. Well, bin Laden's saying he's getting correspondence. Sometimes there's problems in getting them, but we're getting them. But just in case, copy CC Zawahiri. He's the guy in charge anyway. And and by the way, you're absolutely correct. The way this letter reads, it's advice. It reads like a letter from a mentor. I can't think of anyone within Al-Qaeda who'd be able to say, well, send me a letter, but also send it to Zawahiri, right? I mean, that to me says that really is the key that this was bin Laden as well.
Yeah, now there's a fourth file backup, which I didn't send you, Bill, in preparation from the show today, so this is on me. It's because I've been going through all the files and trying to put this all together for the show. This fourth file, which we'll post again maybe when the show comes out, it's a 5-page letter from Zawahiri to Droukdel. So we're just talking about how this author, bin Laden, says keep Zawahiri informed because he's the one basically in charge of following up on the affairs in the Islamic Maghreb. Well, here's a file from October 2007 from Zawahiri to Droukdel, and it's discussing a number of issues, but I thought you'd appreciate this one. One of the things that Zawahiri's commenting on is the charter. And what's the charter? I think it's the GSPC's charter, which becomes then used as the basis for AQIM. And Zawahiri offers his comments. He says, by the way, first of all, Abu Yahya al-Libi had commented on the charter and gave you his thoughts. That overall the charter is very good, but here are some places where we may differ and want you to change some things. And then, of course, Zawahiri, the long-winded intellectual that he is, had to comment himself on what he thought was wrong with the charter. And one of the things that he took issue with is that there was this article apparently that said that it's not permissible to rebel against the Muslim ruler, even if he's unjust and sinful. Apparently, there's a reference to this in the original charter. And of course, Zawahiri knows that's a big no-no in the jihadi scheme. And he goes on and explains why that needs to be revised based on historical examples, but also for religious issues pertaining to religious jurisprudence. But again, this is an example, this file from October 2007, where you can see Zawahiri is in effect corresponding with and giving Droukdel direction, and is in fact commenting on the charter for what becomes AQIM. It's GSPC's charter, which is used as the basis for AQIM. Now here's another file. I'm gonna double up on you here with stuff I'm surprised.
Tom,
with.
Can I comment on that real quick? I mean,
no, absolutely not. Yeah. You cannot. No, I have to filibuster. Of course, go ahead. What were you going to say? Go ahead.
I mean, this should come as no surprise, right? We found another correspondence.
I was waiting for you to say it. The Pakistani Taliban.
The Pakistani Taliban, exactly. Where I believe it was Atiyah and Abu Yahya al-Libi were responding to the charter, and they were actually very forceful in making suggestions to the Pakistani Taliban movement of the Taliban in Pakistan to their charter. So, again, we see, and those two obviously senior Al-Qaeda leadership.
Yep, totally.
And so, we should really, none of this should surprise us when we see it.
No, when I was reviewing this late last night, I thought of you in the Pakistani Taliban one, because I remember when that came out, you saw that right away and said, this is them revising the Pakistani Taliban's charter, you know. And as an example, again, where Pakistani Taliban is one of those organizations where there's been a little bit of disconnected dots, but I think the U.S. government has even recognized in its formal designation of the Pakistani Taliban that it has a symbiotic relationship with Al-Qaeda. A U.S. official described it to me years ago that Al-Qaeda likes to play the shell game. I think that's a good way of putting it.
Sure.
But Bill, what's the significance of that? I mean, they're revising the charter of an organization. That shows a pretty large degree of control or direction, right?
Yeah, right. And there's been other reports too, right, that we've seen where they were telling the Pakistani Taliban to stop poaching from the Al-Qaeda cadres that were operating in the tribal areas and things like that. And there's direct orders. I mean, so if that doesn't, I always believe that the movement of the Taliban in Pakistan is an Al-Qaeda branch, but unofficial. So.
Yeah, and of course they had that basically celebration of Al-Qaeda just recently in that video that we were documenting, the one that starred the infamous Suraj Haqqani, which I love because he's, of course, now the deputy Emir of the Islamic Emir of Afghanistan, which is the Taliban's totalitarian regime. Of course, we know about the Haqqani's relationship with the Pakistani Taliban going back many, many years, harboring and working with the Pakistani Taliban. So that's not really a surprise. But again, it shows the overlap of this stuff and how you have to really be careful in putting together the pieces to understand how this all works.
Yeah, and look, I can't. When you put all this together, how could you not come to the conclusion that Al-Qaeda's general command, or whatever you want to call Al-Qaeda Central, however you want to describe it, is not intimately involved in the details of its in the operations of its affiliates? I mean, you can't come to any other conclusion when you see that, and yet people still do their damnedest to try to disconnect
the dots. Yeah, disconnect the dots. I mean, there's just too much evidence. I mean, there's too much evidence in these files of examples of it, and again, we're going through them, and it's a little bit clumsy on my behalf. I apologize for trying to do it this way, but just trying to give you examples of what we've been looking at for all these years. And here's another one. I'm going to double up on you with an example I didn't give you beforehand, Bill. This is a letter just following up. So we just talked about a letter in October 2007 from Zawahiri to Droukdel. Here's another one from March 2008 from Zawahiri to Droukdel. In this case, remember at the time, Al-Qaeda was agitating against Denmark. This had to do with, the allegedly blasphemous materials that came out of Denmark and elsewhere, the cartoons that Al-Qaeda was trying to agitate and trying to basically strike back and supposedly avenge Muslims for this supposed offense. And he's telling Droukdel that basically we want AQIM to agitate on behalf of this issue, that he got instructions from bin Laden, and bin Laden wanted Zawahiri to relay this to Droukdel. And so here's a letter in March 6, 2008 with Zawahiri explaining, this is what we want you to do. He says, the Danes have committed a repetition of the encroachment upon the Prophet, and even though they do not dare to mention the Jews badly, in other words, they're supposedly negative about the Prophet of Islam, but not the Jews, otherwise they'd be subject to punishment and imprisonment according to their laws. And so then he goes on and on and on. Of course, this is somewhat short-winded, I guess, for Zawahiri's sake. But basically, he's telling Droukdel, do what you can to go after the Danes. Again, more evidence. And by the way, Bill, I found, going through the files, this letter was also sent to the Islamic State of Iraq at the same time in 2008. And Zawahiri sends it to Abu Omar al-Baghdadi, and he sends it to, al-Muhajir, who was the other leader, Abu Hamza al-Muhajir, who was the other leader of the Islamic State of Iraq at the time. Both of them, he sends it to both of them. Again, giving instructions to the so-called affiliates in different ways.
Exactly. I don't think I even need to comment on this. It's, just further supporting evidence, right?
Yeah, now we have other evidence, too. We went through the files. We found a bunch of files, or some files anyway, talking about ransoms for hostages. This is something we wrote up in 2013. I remember even before the files were released about this, that, AQIM itself was talking about how Al-Qaeda senior leadership is overseeing the hostage operations, and that bin Laden wanted to use AQIM's hostages to force France to withdraw from Afghanistan and for other reasons. And, you had the AQIM commanders even saying that Al-Qaeda senior leadership has stepped in to oversee these negotiations. Again, another example of connectivity or connective tissue between what's happening in Africa and Al-Qaeda senior leadership, which was then at that time, according to these files and everything else, headquartered in Pakistan and, of course, Afghanistan.
Yeah, and look, the hostage, right? We're going to go back to Pakistan, right? We've seen these types of issues again. I can't recall the direct files, but you'll probably remember this, Tom. You have that brilliant memory where Al Qaeda General Command would be talking about getting their cuts from the hostage ransoms.
Yeah, this is the one you helped. There was a report in the New York Times you helped them piece together. Actually,
yes, that's right.
Had to do with the Afghan official was kidnapped by the Pakistani Taliban.
Yes,
and was being held. They were using the Haqqanis were basically the middlemen between the negotiations. Who were negotiating everything. Again, the Haqqanis, which were now laying down before in Afghanistan as the U.S. retreats. Yay, America. The U.S., basically at that time, Al-Qaeda was coordinating these ransoms and basically talking about who was going to get what in terms of, and it was sort of funny in that correspondence as a separate memo. You remember where basically the other jihadis started to figure out they got these billions of dollars in ransoms, right, for this official and for others. And everybody started to want their cut. You alluded to the mob earlier. It was sort of that kind of dynamic, where basically people started wanting their cut of the whole thing, But that's another example where, Al-Qaeda is working through these other groups to accomplish its goals.
Yeah, again, repeating myself, but, this is what direction from the highest level looks like. It's
a lot more direction, a lot more guidance, a lot more connectivity than's been previously assumed. Now, this brings me to the last example we're going to go through today. I got a ton of examples, but I see the clock is running here, and if you want me to filibuster for the next 7 hours on Bin Laden's files, we can do that. But we'll talk about files that were recovered outside Bin Laden's compound.
This is my, look, Tom, I'm going to just
go ahead, go for it. Yeah,
this is my, of all the files we've gotten and from the Bin Laden files and everything, I think this is my favorite. I'll let you explain it, but I just
explain why it's your favorite. Go for it. First of all, we got to give a hat tip to the badass that Rukmini Kalamaki is from the New York Times, right? She's just a badass reporter, and we hope to have her on the podcast. I'm hoping to have her on. She's somebody who really we admire in terms of reporting. And I know why I find these files that she found fascinating. But go for it.
Yeah, so she goes into what I believe it was northern Mali after Ansar Dine occupied the area, and then they were driven out.
And Ansar Dine was, of course, another Al-Qaeda cutout.
Exactly. And she goes and she finds all these documents in a building. I believe it was in Timbuktu, if I'm correct. One of these documents is a correspondence between Waheshi, of course, was AQAP's Emir and ultimately became Al-Qaeda's general manager and deputy, and Droukdel. And Waheshi is advising Droukdel on... he's actually giving so Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula had occupied large areas of southern and central Yemen from 2011 to 2012. And Waheshi gives this basically an after-action report. He tells him, hey, this is what worked. This is what didn't. He gives him details like, don't try to enforce your religious views too harshly, too quickly. The people have lived in sin for a long time. So I'm paraphrasing here. So that
paraphrase.
You need to like bring it to them slowly and, bring them along with it. He tells them, just all of these operational details. It's just a fact, and this is from, so, you're wondering, is it he's sending it as the head of AQAP, at the head of one branch to the head of another branch as just sort of like some advice, or was he at that time sending it as, well, we don't really know what year he began his position as Al-Qaeda's general manager or deputy, so we don't really know when that started, so we don't know what position he's taking from. But even if, at the very least, if it's doing it from branch to branch, you're seeing that connective tissue again between the two branches. And I guess it's probably a lot of my affection for this is the way Rukmini covered this. I think if I recall, Tom, nobody was interested in this information, right?
Yeah, I want her to tell a story because we'll tell our story from the Bin Laden files. Let her tell the story.
Yeah, right. I'll leave it at that.
So there's a lot of she found evidence that was inconvenient for certain narratives, and it turns out the people that adhere to those narratives don't want to hear it, and that's just sort of that's basically our lives, right? And all this stuff, right? I mean, you could just point to all these. We're going to get to that in example again on Afghanistan in a second, because I got a funny one we got to finish the show with.
Yeah, I mean, and so
go ahead.
just to make, I mean, look, one of the Bin Laden files on actually proved information that I had gotten and published and was actually ridiculed a little bit about, hiding the relationship between Shabab. So you'd think I'd love that one, or ones related to Pakistani Taliban. But somehow it winds up being an AQIM related document. But God bless Rukmini for what she did and what she continues to do in the work in this correspondence. And I really hope we can get her on one day soon.
Well, and again, these files, it was all about emirate building, right? It was all about building the emirate in West Africa and around Mali. Again, it's something where certain analysts have held through the years. I don't mean to criticize people, because people make mistakes, but what bothers me is when certain ideas stick and they're just not based on evidence, And there was this sort of mantra that Al-Qaeda is not really interested in acquiring or territory or building a caliphate. Nonsense. That's what they're all about. And you could see in those files that Rukmini captured, that was what the whole discussion was. And my favorite part of the files actually was the little wink about Ansar al-Sharia.
Yes.
Remember,
that's right.
remember Waheshi says to Droukdel, if the relationship between you and Ansar al-Sharia is the same as ours, wink, basically, And what he's saying there is Ansar al-Sharia stood up as a political front for IQAP in Yemen. Nobody ever disputed that. We had these arguments with people back in the 2011, 2012 timeframe about Ansar al-Sharia in Tunisia, Egypt, and Libya, all conspicuously headed by people with known al-Qaeda connections, by the way, or former al-Qaeda veterans, by the way, who had gotten out of prison, and supposedly we're supposed to believe this is all just a giant coincidence. Again, you can add this to the list, folks, of episodes we're going to do, because I'm going to do my rant on Ansar al-Sharia one day and revisit this. But subsequently, it comes out that we were right. And Ansar al-Sharia, they were fronts for al-Qaeda. Of course they were. You can see that in designations. You can see that in various literature. You can see that in stuff they've even said. AQIM eventually admits that they were backing Ansar al-Sharia in Libya and Tunisia. But that's my favorite part of the thing, is that internally, where the Americans are debating whether or not Ansar al-Sharia is really part of al-Qaeda or not, or part of the al-Qaeda web. Here's one al-Qaeda commander saying to another, wink, we all know what's going on here,
And one more point, if al-Qaeda wasn't interested in gaining territory and only wanted to attack the West, why did it make the effort to take control of southern Yemen, northern Mali, large areas of Somalia, supports the Afghan Taliban's Jihad, declared the Islamic Emirate of Waziristan in Pakistan, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I've always, that's just a willful misunderstanding of what's happening with Al-Qaeda is all about. And when people want to make up narratives like that, it really does a disservice to our field. The evidence is all there that Al-Qaeda is all about building the caliphate, and they have. And this is what this letter discusses: the sacrifices that AQAP made to try to establish that emirate in Yemen, and what worked, what didn't. I remember he says they lost like 500 fighters, and it's a very detailed after action report. And again, it's fascinating, these types of things. I just can't get enough of it.
Yeah, and of course, AQIM is still pursuing the long-term caliphate building project in West Africa today. Droukdel played a big role in that and standing up. This episode's all about Droukdel up till this point anyway. Abdulmalek Droukdel, this AQIM Emir, longtime figure in al-Qaeda circles, who was killed on June 3rd, a very significant figure, important kill for France, the U.S., and its allies in the region. But there's still busy working toward building a caliphate in West Africa. It's a long-term vision. It's not something that's near fruition at all right now, of course, but it's not the feckless, delusion or absurd fantasy that John Brennan, who was President Obama's counterterrorism advisor, made it out to be in 2012. This is a motivating part of their ideology and why they fight and what they're trying to do. And it's all throughout the documents they're talking about that. That's what they're all about trying to do. And what we're seeing now is the U.S. basically is trying to get out of the game of preventing them from building a caliphate. The U.S. doesn't really want to be in these fights at all. Well, they're still fighting. And that's why it's known as the endless jihad. look, again, I've said it a couple times in this episode, we'll post links to these documents so you can read through them. But we got to close the show this week on something I find funny. I mean, at this point, this is all ludicrous. So, but General McKenzie, the CENTCOM commander, apparently attended this event in D.C. at one of these think tanks. Of course, we work for a think tank in D.C., even though we're not in D.C. Apparently via Zoom, I would guess. I haven't seen a full transcript of what he said, but apparently he said something along the lines of that the Taliban is not fully complying with the February 29th withdrawal agreement that was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban.
Just when I thought I was out, they pulled me back in.
Now, I mean, the Taliban has to do minimal amount of stuff to comply with this agreement. I mean, it's the onus is, the burden is not on them. This is a withdrawal deal. There's this language that we've critiqued multiple times about their counterterrorism assurances when it comes to Al Qaeda. And basically, McKenzie said something along the lines of Al Qaeda is still present in Afghanistan. I got to pull the full remarks to get exactly what he said, but he said something along those lines. Well, Bill, I noticed just in the last day that, before we're recording this, the Taliban issued a statement in Pashto on one of its Voice of Jihad websites, in which they denied that Al Qaeda is even present in Afghanistan. So they actually, this is now the first statement I could see that they've said in some time that actually explicitly mentions Al Qaeda, and it's to tell a lie, to say that Al Qaeda isn't even there, that it hasn't been present since the days of Islamic Emirate before that fell in 2001. I mean, this is just a bunch of baloney. But now we're supposed to believe that the Taliban is our counterterrorism partner and is going to prevent Al Qaeda from attacking the West and hunt them down and destroy them in Afghanistan, as Secretary Pompeo claimed. Meanwhile, they're issuing statements saying, Al Qaeda's not even here. I mean, it's just ludicrous.
They not just Al Qaeda. They say no foreign fighters whatsoever.
Oh, I know, but this is now this is a new statement though. You covered the one about no foreign fighters.
Right.
They've said that over and over again. This is now saying Al Qaeda isn't there specifically. So in response to McKenzie, because McKenzie is saying Al Qaeda is still there and it's a problem. And now we're supposed to believe the Taliban is going to come clean about all this and work with us against Al Qaeda, according to the State Department, where they're not even admitting that Al Qaeda is even there. And it brings me to a point. Why does that matter in the connective tissue here? Well, Abdulmalek Droukdel, as the Emir of AQIM, was presumably killed on June 3rd, according to the French and the U.S. He's just the latest Al-Qaeda regional commander to be killed. They've suffered now. Al-Qaeda suffered some losses in recent months at the top echelon of their regional branches. We talked about in a previous episode how Qasim al-Raymi was killed in January of this year in Yemen, and he was replaced by Khalid Batarfi. And of course, in September of 2019, Asim Umar, who was the first emir of Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent, was killed in a Taliban stronghold in Musa Qala Helmand. Of course, this is an example of the type of Al-Qaeda guys who are running around Afghanistan that the Taliban is pretending aren't there. Here's Asim Umar. Now, he may not have been the emir of AQIS at the time of his death. He may have moved on to another position in Al-Qaeda's hierarchy, but he was certainly the first emir of AQIS. So there you got three guys who played a big role in forming Al-Qaeda's regional architecture and also senior leadership roles, we would argue, and some evidence, and we have direct evidence in some of the cases that that's true. And they're all taken out in recent months, but you don't think that's the end of any of them, right, Bill? They're going to keep going.
No, they're resilient. They have a deep bench. Asim Umar was we don't know. Like you said, we don't know what his.
He was the first emir of AQIS, but again, Al Qaeda hasn't released a statement about his death either.
Yeah,
so you mentioned earlier about how some of these guys are going unremarked these days. There's no martyrdom statement for him. So
yeah, he led for at least 4 or 5 years. Qasim al-Raymi had 5 years. His predecessor had almost a decade.
Yeah, because Qasim al-Raymi actually had all the way back to 2009 as a senior leader of AQP. He was a military commander and then emir. Yeah,
and
and Droukdel goes all the way back to
I'm trying to calculate
days,
in my head.
The 1990s. Yeah, he goes back to the 1990s. I mean, this is the point. We're going to conclude this episode on this point. Listen, this is great that Droukdel's been taken out of the game. This guy started waging jihad, as far as we know, in the 1990s, maybe even earlier, depending on what his root the story is on Afghanistan going back in the days.
Yeah, and
we're here in
the leader,
2020, and we just got a senior Al-Qaeda leader who's been in the game since the 1990s.
And is arguably a leader of jihadist operations in North Africa, now West Africa, for 2 decades, right? GSPC plus, add his time at GSPC.
16 years at least. GSPC in 2004, he takes over in 2004. Yeah. He oversees the merger of GSPC to become AQIM in 2006, 2007, and he spawns a new Al-Qaeda group in the Group for the Support of Islam and Muslims, which is fighting in West Africa and through, still getting support of AQIM. I mean, this is not, Droukdel's out of the game, but his heirs are not. His former comrades are not. His fighters.
They're
aren't.
waiting a long time. They've had a lot of experience under him. They've been in this game just as long as most of them, just as long as him. Yeah, our problem isn't, we believe take them out. We're just not taking them out fast enough, and that really is the problem.
And it's too late, I think. I think the winds now are against these missions anyway. So.
Yeah, the French went out of North Africa. I mean, the New York Times had a great piece maybe a month or two ago about how the French are looking for the exit in North Africa. And
but the Taliban's denial of Al Qaeda's presence in Afghanistan brings up a point, Bill. Do you think Al Qaeda can deny the presence of Al Qaeda in West Africa, and that would justify the French withdrawal? Do you think they would call for that?
That might be. Maybe that's
maybe
exactly.
if Al Qaeda just comes out and says no Al Qaeda to see here, don't worry about it, we're all good. Maybe that's enough to get everybody out. So
maybe they can issue a video from while in West Africa, right in the desert. Issue that video and say no, we're not here, and everyone will believe them.
Yeah. Well, we're a little jaded, if you can't tell, about all this stuff, but we're trying to get into some details this week about. Jaded, cynical. I don't like skeptical, by the way, because skepticism is sort of the heart of Western civilization when you get to the whole history of it. So skepticism is a great thing, but jaded, cynical, that's definitely where we're at. In any event, so we try to go into a little bit of detail this week on Abdulmalek Droukdel and put him in perspective in his career and what he's done. The French said he's dead. The U.S. Africa Command says he's dead. It'd be great if the U.S. government could confirm what the French have said about his role, not just as AQIM's Emir, but as a senior leader within Al-Qaeda's global hierarchy. Of course, we're still waiting for such confirmation. But we'll keep plugging along here because it's an endless jihad after all. And thank you for listening to this week's episode of Generation Jihad. Please do subscribe to the show. As a reminder, you can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or anywhere else you listen to your shows. And we'll see you again next week.